The multiverse. Name me a concept with more potential that also causes audiences to groan and roll their eyes every time they hear it mentioned. Well, you got me there. But I'm talking about something that's not a genre. Instead, I'm thinking more of an idea that ripples throughout the ages, sparking the imagination, only for it to overplay its hand and reveal how limited infinite possibility really is. And yet, you still see this re-emerging all the time, especially in the last couple of years where it seems like the floodgates been pried open on stories featuring parallel worlds, alternate timelines, and even universes colliding. And sure, while plenty of stories these days like Invincible, Marvel and DC, and even the Looney Tunes have been dipping their toe into this pond, we gotta remember that it's been around for a while. From back in the days with stories like Sliders, Fringe, and the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, to more classic examples like Back to the Future, Star Trek, and even more before that. It is truly a concept where the sky is the limit, yet it itself has garnered something of a bad reputation.
Time for a cheaper approach. Allow me to introduce the multiverse.
Which is strange considering it has so much opportunity for storytelling, and still, people have become generally turned off by it. And you know what, I feel like that's something worth investigating. What is it that made multiverses so popular in the first place? What kind of stories can you tell with them at the center? And do audiences really have a problem with the multiverse itself? Or is it more the writing around them? So, let's discuss. Alright, so the multiverse. For any of you who need a refresher, the multiverse is not just a fighting game where Shaggy powers up to his Ultra Instinct form to kick the Joker's ass, but also a concept that sees infinite variations of our worlds across space and time, some so similar that you could never spot the difference, and others that vary so vastly that, well, you get the idea. All of them existing simultaneously while never under any normal circumstances crossing paths. And through the magic of storytelling, we are granted the opportunity to peer into such worlds and find something of interest worth following. But this is all just what a multiverse is. The question we gotta answer is, how does it actually get used in terms of stories beyond just being the general log line of, in a world where, and insert whatever events you want to occur. Well, considering every story exists in some kind of a multiverse, the first thing I'd argue you'd have to do is draw on its initial premise. And that means using one world to contrast another in order to highlight the differences between the two. Because much like in all equations, you need constants and variables in order to reach your conclusion. So the only thing they necessarily need to have in common is for a point of view character to recognize that they are no longer in the same world that they came from and be able to spot the differences between the two. There also needs to be explicit parallels that go beyond just, general gravity and the existence of oxygen. Air! Otherwise, they're just in a different place and not an alternate version of one they should recognize. You also need to keep in mind that though the multiverse sounds like a sci-fi concept, the genre of the multiverse tale itself is actually pretty inconsequential to whether or not it can occur. Because the only thing the genre really does is facilitate the means in which transporting from one reality to another can be facilitated. So in sci-fi, you might have interdimensional stargates or wormholes, or maybe a cross-dimensional transporter. While in fantasy stories, maybe you'd have magic, portals, or spells, or rabbit holes, whatever you need. Yeah, another key element that makes a multiverse story the alternate universe isn't so much another place in space, but rather across space, if you catch what I mean. You need like some kind of interdimensional portal, or some means that result in you getting there beyond three-dimensional methods. And yes, that even applies to the Barbie movie, alright? It looked like they had to go through a bit of cosmic trickery in order to get from the doll world to the hellscape we call home in the Milky Way galaxy. It also differs from time travel stories in that, in a time travel tale, unless you're specifically dealing with the multiple versions of the same world, like in the case of something like Back to the Future, if you're simply just going to a different point in history, then that's functionally no different than traveling to another country or planet. Unless we're dealing with different versions of the same point in time, or relatively around that point, then it's not necessarily a multiverse tale. Time travel can facilitate multiverse tales, but one is not explicitly the other. Something like the difference between Back to the Future 1 and 2 is a good example. The first one is merely just a time travel story, based on the fact that we never have one world interact with the other, until the very end, at which point they just decide to live there. But the sequel does have branching timelines, and the whole plot revolves around how do we undo what got us here. But these are simply singular parallel worlds. And as we explained, the multiverse is, well, infinite. So aside from the difference between one universe where you're poor and a universe where you're rich, what else could this narrative device have to offer? Stories like Star Trek introduce worlds where it's possible that the version of you that you encounter is not as friendly as you might think. In fact, they might be down and out evil. Yeah, another common trope the multiverse offers is the evil twin universe, where everyone in said parallel reality is just as I described. This is often done when you have a cast of recognizable characters, like in TV shows or long-running film series, and now you want to see what it would look like if they were to fight a version of themselves that took a darker path. Another use is to follow storylines that take place in alternate history worlds, like one where the Axis powers won World War II, a world where mystical creatures will come to cross paths with our society, or an often go-to trope, the fish out of water story, where one or more people will be transported from one reality to another, such as the case of something like the Smurfs, Once Upon a Time, and Last Action Hero. A lot of animes will do this, so much so that they've even given it a category of its own called the isekai. Or an isekai, I don't know, someone in the comments will correct me. So those are some go-to stories you can tell with the multiverse. But there's also the idea of playing with the multiverse itself. Because why limit yourself between jumping between one or two universes when you have an infinite number at your disposal? Shows like Sliders, Fringe, hell, even The Man in the High Castle would play with this idea. And you can really see why this is such an enticing narrative device to play with, because by doing so you basically unlock the secret to infinite possibilities appearing in whatever tale you're telling. If I haven't made it clear by now, the multiverse is a wellspring of ideas, but with so many options, now we get into a bit of the problem that comes with introducing a multiverse into your story. The first hurdle you might run into is that if there are just so many worlds, what makes any of them all that special? Like, how can you have any real consequences or stakes if out there in the universe there exists another world where everything worked out? Like, if a character dies and there's a million other universes out there where they don't, what's to stop us from going over there and bringing them to our world? Series like Rick and Morty tackle this nihilism head on, and makes the mayhem and chaos this all invites part of the point, though doing so with a bit more gross out humor than to my personal taste. But other stories find ways of skirting around this problem by usually making it just extremely difficult to travel from one universe to another, so much so that doing so is not worth the headache. Most of the time when characters end up falling into these multiverses, a big plot point is how do we get back home? But these are all just issues you can solve over the runtime of the story. Asking the question, what does one life matter in the vastness of the multiverse? Or how do I find myself when there's so many others to choose from? Things like that have been solved in the past and resulted in very well executed narratives.
It was me, Barry. I f***ed you off at super speed so it'd seem like you it at just a woman's touch.
But now we come to the issue of why today people are getting so tired of the multiverse. How come when people hear about it, they just groan, roll their eyes, and think, oh god, this again, really? Even I myself am getting sick and tired of hearing the words multiple and universes slapped together into one conjunctive noun that pretty much just spells doom for whatever storyline I was hoping to get invested in. And that is because of the nature of how a multiverse works, the biggest hurdle it has to contend with isn't any science or magical mumbo jumbo, but rather something that a lot of stories are faced with, and that is bad writing.
Who wrote this?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that you yourself hate multiverses. I think the thing you are most fed up with is just poor execution. But why are multiverses such a magnet for subpar screenwriters? Well, that's where we run into the dilemma of infinite possibilities. Because think about it, when the solution to all problems can be go to the dimension where all the problems are solved, what really is the conflict there? It's for this reason you need to be smart and construct reasonable boundaries for what can and cannot be achieved. And a lot of writers just might not be up to the task. Stories need to, after all, give a justified reason for why the events that are unfolding are playing out as they do. The multiverse, on the other hand, does not require this careful planning. Once you have the means of setting up worlds colliding, it can become exceedingly easy to use the very conceit of the multiverse to cover up what is essentially just lazy writing.
That's just lazy writing.
And that's what we've been seeing a lot of lately. Especially from the bigwigs over at Marvel and DC, who have just been kind of using this as a mechanism to smash multiple action figures together. Which is extra ironic considering the fact that comic books themselves have been at the forefront of this concept for the better part of the last century. At least since they started explicitly delving into it with the 1961 Flash comic book, The Flash of Two Worlds, where the mainline Flash, Barry Allen, would interact with his alternate universe counterpart, Jay Garrick, in a meeting between the two fastest men alive. This moment pretty much revitalized the entirety of the Golden Age line of comics, dating back to the late 1930s, claiming that all these tales took place on a separate world, and somewhere out there in the multiverse, their stories would continue on, even if we, the audience, were not seeing them. And from here, DC would pretty much pioneer the multiverse within the realm of superhero stories. And Marvel would follow in suit with a few Fantastic Four tales, as well as releasing their iconic publication, What If? A series where we get to explore different renditions of our favorite characters, had things gone slightly differently. DC would try something similar with a line called Elseworlds, and with it achieve their own level of success. And with the multiverse established, it allowed for them to do so many different things with their characters, involving crossing over different worlds and plot lines. Unfortunately, sometimes the conflicts felt more manufactured than natural to the story, giving it less of the feeling of worlds colliding and more like the studio from on high mandating that these specific plot points are hit. It's for reasons like this you get a million crises in DC, or over-bloated toy commercials at Marvel. And unfortunately, it seems like that the movie studios, whilst adapting the comic multiverse storylines, also took some notes from the producers back in the day, resulting in a much more manufactured feeling style of storytelling. Corporations trying to find the cheapest avenue possible in order to facilitate brand synergy, all without doing the difficult legwork from the get-go in order to justify these interactions in a well-told film or television series. Stories like Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness or Deadpool and Wolverine aren't really interested in exploring their characters through the multiverse, but instead setting up cool fight scenes to watch unfold, which admittedly can be thrilling in their own right, but not when it comes at the expense of a good story being told. This is especially problematic in Deadpool and Wolverine, where after the initial jumping from one universe to another to find the perfect Hugh Jackman, we spend the rest of the story stuck in some barren wasteland just to facilitate a bunch of different cameos. And the characters really don't get to have much of an arc. I'll do a greater deep dive into this film another time, but in short, I felt it left a lot to be desired in terms of its exploration to its characters and storylines, in favor of more cheap thrills and getting to see characters realized on screen that have been teased for the better part of a decade. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness had a similar problem, being unable to stay focused on the central question at the heart of its narrative: can Stephen Strange ever truly be happy? A good theme to focus your multiverse tale around, but with the movie itself and, to be honest, the greater part of the Marvel Universe being generally uninterested in Doctor Strange as a person, and more of a plot device tasked with moving the real important characters from scene to scene. And as a result, any exploration of Stephen's character does feel less like the film's main central premise, and more of an afterthought that they threw in out of obligation at the 11th hour. And his arc gets ultimately lost in the woodwork between Wanda's evil machinations, and all the cameos littered throughout this mystical journey into madness. In fact, the only multiverse story I thought that Marvel has handled well thus far is Spider-Man No Way Home, where we do indeed get to have that introspection and look at how the mainline universe Spider-Man stacks up against the others, and the lessons he can learn from them. It is helped by the fact that I'm a huge Spider-Man fan and was definitely excited to see two of my favorite actors return to the role, but the story they were in didn't just use them as cameos for an action scene and a quip or two, but instead gave them supporting roles to help this universe's version of Spider-Man learn the lessons they wish they could have known when they were just starting out. And as a bonus, they even get some closure in their respective storylines, allowing every one of these three Spider-Man to have grown a little bit from this adventure. It is a little strange that after 3 years and maybe a dead uncle or two, this Spider-Man still hasn't completed his origin, but hey, that was the plot they were choosing to go with, and I feel like they told it pretty well. Though funny enough, I think this story was actually told a little bit better in 2018 with Into the Spider-Verse, Sony's animated rendition of a similar tale. Into the Spider-Verse nailed this perfectly by focusing the story around Miles Morales comparing himself to his hero, and then being granted the opportunity to see different versions of him, all with different lessons they seek to impart. The main Spider-Man outside of Miles that we'll be following is also Peter B. Parker, who is similar enough to the hero that inspired the fledgling Spider-Man, but with his own history and baggage, that allows both the heroes to grow throughout their journey by inspiring one another. And Across the Spider-Verse poses the question of free will versus determinism by centering the story around an unchangeable moment in the character's history, or as they call it, a canon event. Making this a tale about fighting one's fate and breaking the cycle of torment in favor of a better future. But if this is all a little too heady for you, then, they also threw a few cameos in there for good measure, so there's that.
It's rude to stare.
But it's never more than just icing on the cake. Both films never lose sight on the mission they've embarked on, and in the end, I feel accomplished the goal it set out to achieve. And that is telling a story about its characters with the multiverse as a backdrop. And that's something you want to keep in mind. When a movie features, well, anything really, you don't want that element to be interchangeable with something else. You want everything in the film to feel like it has to be there for this story to be told. And if the multiverse is going to be part of it, then you want to explore this concept to a perfect degree where it justifies its own existence, while also furthering the narrative you're trying to construct. Both Spider-Verse films do this tremendously by exploring the ramifications of going across these dimensional rifts, and more importantly, how they affect the people in these parallel worlds. But there's also a film that exists that, to no one's surprise, does this, in my opinion, better than nearly any other. And crazy enough, it's not even a superhero movie. In fact, it's not even all that much a AAA blockbuster, but rather the A24 mid-budget film, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I know, so original. But everyone else on this platform has gotten their chance to sing this movie's praise, so now it's my turn. Not only does this film have tremendous acting, effects work, especially considering the budget, and choreography, But by centering its argument around how can anything really matter if it already all exists, paired up with a family drama where everyone's relationships are slowly degrading, allows them to explore both the high concepts of finding meaning in infinite chaos, along with learning to value and cherish those in your life, understanding that it's because of the finite nature of our existence that the moments we spend with each other mean so much. So not only does this movie use the multiverse well to explore its central premise, but it also has fun with the idea. Imagining being able to swap different things from different realities in and out from one another, or how small, insignificant seeming changes can have massive ripple effects down the line, resulting in things like hot dogs for fingers, or everyone just being sentient rocks. The movie really does get to play with the idea of infinite possibility, while still focusing on what really matters, which not only is the theme of the movie, but also its greatest strength. The movie is both able to communicate its central message while demonstrating it at the same time. So yeah, not really so much a hot take, but an excellent use of the multiverse, and one many can draw inspiration from. But as we wrap things up, I think the most important takeaway from this discussion is that there's so much possibility when working with a concept as vast as the multiverse. With infinite worlds in the palm of your hand, it should be considered a crime not to be able to tell a fun and engaging narrative with such a premise. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, it has been co-opted by special interest groups who only see it as a cheap gimmick, one allowing them to get away with the most contrived of setups. It's fine for it to be used once in a while for these cheap gimmicks, but when it's the main way to play, I mean, it's no wonder that people are growing fatigued by its mere mention. And in all honesty, I'm not too sad to see it slowly dying out in popular fiction. DC seems to be streamlining to one singular universe, and Marvel looks to wrap it all up in Secret Wars, probably resulting in a big universe-wide reset where everything is just on one singular planet. And if history taught us anything, it's that these guys seem to be leading the pack in terms of the decisions Hollywood makes as a whole. But I don't want to see multiverses go away entirely. I think they have a place in fiction, alongside every other larger-than-life conception. It'd be nice if they could scale back on using them as just cheap cameo machines to get a cheer out of audiences, and instead really dive into how the world around us can be a lens to see what's going on beneath the surface. So unless it's got strong writing, I think a story with the multiverse in it has the potential to tell the most groundbreaking tales we've ever seen. And if you don't think that you're the kind of writer who's up to the task, then maybe dive into the multiverse yourself and find us a version of you who can. And do it fast before they get AI writing this shit.